Hello, hello, hello everyone. Hello Silvio. Hi. Hello Jorge. Okay, let me pin the topic as usual. Okay. Here it is. Okay, great. Today we will be talking about vintage variation. Okay, let me invite Frank. Hi Elena. Hi, hi, hi. Hello Frank.
Good evening.
Good
Hello.
evening.
Hello,
Hello, how
everybody.
are you?
I am good.
uh,
What about you?
good. Good. I'm good.
Sun is shining?
Yeah, sun's shining finally and starting to feel the spring.
Good.
And it looks like we are gonna go into they made a plan here and they explained it yesterday. It's
Yeah.
gonna be four-phase plan
Yeah.
for the get out of the confinement.
Sure. Sure.
Yes.
And I
So we'll see
suppose
how it goes.
that most of the Spanish people already started at level 4.
Yes, that's
Uh,
true. That's true.
I was reading it. I was reading it this morning. I was thinking, well, this is asking a lot of disciplined people to follow it to follow it step by step. I'm curious how that will go.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
mean, in the Netherlands, and I would consider ourselves a little bit more disciplined than the average Spanish people.
yes.
But even here, you can see that the discipline is getting a bit weaker now. People are so fed up with it, and you see that the infection rate is going down a bit, and so people allow themselves a bit more liberty. So not easy.
Yeah. Yeah, I think from phase 0, we will jump straight to the phase 4. But
Yeah.
also on the other hand, like there's a calendar, but it is not really strictly defined. So
No,
we'll see
exactly,
how it is going to happen.
exactly. Yeah, we'll see. We'll
Okay.
see.
So
Good.
great. So today we will talk about vintage variation.
Yes.
Vintage variation. Um, I don't know. Shall we start with what is vintage variation and how or why is it important or is it important? Why does it matter?
Well, it matters because I think that the difference in quality between vintages is much bigger than people seem to realize. And we'll talk more. We'll talk more in detail about different regions, but well, let me first of all say that when I started in the wine business, which was of course in the Iron Age, and
Let
meaning
me guess, let me guess, let me.
1985. Um,
Okay.
but in those years, um, no matter where you went in the world, well, the world was much smaller, of course. The wine world was much smaller. It was basically Europe, of course, with a strong domination of France. But
Mm-hmm.
prices of wine would follow the pattern of the quality of the vintages. And with the exception of Bordeaux nowadays, I'm thinking all the time, what the hell has happened? We're paying exactly the same price everywhere, no matter the quality of the vintage. But the
Mm-hmm.
quality of the vintage, sure, the variation, the difference is smaller in these post or during climate change times as it was before. I
Mm-hmm.
happily admit that. Um, I mean, in the 1970s, 1980s, there were terribly weak vintages around, and that actually continued till, I mean, even the early 90s were in most regions quite poor, 91, 92, 93, 94. But since then, the very weak vintages seem to have disappeared because of climate change. So that's true.
Mm-hmm.
That's true.
Mm-hmm.
But for example, a vintage that is almost generally a very weak and sometimes really poor vintage is 2014, almost everywhere, and nobody seems to care. Prices remain exactly the same. People buy
Mm-hmm.
it, and
You said
actually,
2014.
14, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was a week. Wow, it was very cold all over Europe. There
Mm-hmm.
was plenty of rain during the summer, almost everywhere, huh? Including
Mm-hmm.
Spain. And each time that I'm tasting 2014s, I'm thinking, oh my God, there's another one. The acidity is too high. They're a bit thin. They're a bit unbalanced. In the red wines, the tannins aren't ripe, and I'm just thinking, what the hell, um, and I'm thinking of that vintage specifically because I once made a remark on Facebook with the
Mm-hmm.
same remark that I just made, that is a poor vintage. And it actually triggered a shitstorm of reactions. And there were a number of people really furious that I dared saying that and said, no, you got it all wrong. And it was either people saying, no, I don't agree. I think it's actually a lovely vintage. But they were
Mm-hmm.
just saying that because the acidity was high and the wines were light. So they were actually, of course, going for the elegance
Elegance.
in wine, as we
Mm-hmm.
discussed it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there were people saying, you cannot just dismiss a vintage all like that. And do you know what harm you are doing to producers and whatever? And I was thinking, harm, harm, harm. These producers, they know it's not a good vintage, but
Mm-hmm.
they still sell it to us for exactly the same price as other much better vintages. So I think it's our, well, I don't know. Why shouldn't we complain about that?
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand that. Yeah.
Um,
That's a bit that's a bit the way I think nowadays about vintage variation, with the exception of
mm-hmm.
Bordeaux, by the way, because in Bordeaux, generally speaking, in a way, it's not 100%, not 1-to-1, but in a way, Bordeaux prices tend to follow the quality of vintages, but they are
Mm-hmm.
the only one.
Yeah, so talking about Bordeaux, I'm curious to exactly to understand and to know better how the vintages, good vintages, bad vintages are declared. So as far as I know, let's say in Bordeaux, like 5-6 months after the harvest, the vintage, like around March,
Yeah,
journalists, wine writers, influencers, wine
buyers.
influencers, buyers, they go
Yeah,
and they taste the wines,
yeah,
and then it's like a industry professional tasting,
yeah.
and then a few months later they declare the opinion, right?
Mm,
Or how does it work?
Well, there is no official declaration of a Bordeaux vintage. Huh? Not official, but unofficially, of course. In a way, yes. But I think Bordeaux, because of the enormous volume of rather expensive wine that it produces, which is of course a fivefold in volume of what Burgundy produces or any other high quality region.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and because of the sort of market system, the Place de Bordeaux, as it has been developed over time, um,
Mm-hmm.
it's a sort of a very complex, but nevertheless well-functioning, um, let's say, system in which at the end of the day, everybody will kind of agree on the quality of that vintage. There was, of course, a period that there was one person who decided on the quality of the vintage. That was Robert Parker.
Mm-hmm.
We could actually do a session about Parker as well.
Okay, maybe
I've got a
I'm
lot to say
taking a
about
note
that.
of.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
nowadays it's a bit more open. But usually there's consensus. It's good, it's bad, it's mixed, whatever. But it's very open. And there are so many people who have the possibility to taste those wines, to judge those wines, who have an idea about quality. That at the end of the day there is a kind of consensus on vintages. Kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Kind of consensus.
Yeah.
Officially declaration, it happens in Porto vintages, they declare officially, right? And in Champagne, it is declared officially.
No, 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 no,
No, it's not
no, no,
official
not
either
at
in
all, not at
Champagne.
all. No, no, in Champagne, and actually that's another example in case of my theory, because actually, in the good old days, and to some
Mm-hmm.
extent this still goes for some of the high quality houses, but in the good old days, people would only produce vintage or top cuvée champagnes in really good vintages. And to be honest, this is also gone. Even wines like Cristal or Dom Pérignon, they're produced nowadays in 7 or 8 out of 10 vintages. And Bollinger Grande Année, purely for marketing reasons, 007. But Grande Année Bollinger was released in the 2007 vintage, which was not a particularly good vintage, and actually it was a very disappointing wine. So, and nevertheless very expensive, you know. So Champagne is actually another very good example of how over time the idea of you know, distinguishing the really good vintage from the other ones has mellowed down a bit. Not for everybody, not always. Salon is still very restrictive about the years that they produce Salon, but yeah, basically you are allowed to produce vintage Champagne every year you want, and it happens every year you want. There are people producing vintage Champagne in every year for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Which isn't good.
Which isn't good.
No, because I think actually the idea, I thought about it, and I think actually what happened was that whereas in the past vintage Champagne was a selection of wine from the best vintages, it has now become a selection of the best wine from every vintage. And that's something totally different.
Can you say it again?
In the past, that's my theory, yeah?
Yeah.
This is my personal theory. In the past, vintage Champagne was only produced in the best vintages, not by law, but by
like common sense, maybe.
Yeah. And nowadays, it seems to become more and more the best wine produced in a single vintage, and that is not the same thing. So even in a weak vintage, or let's say maybe not weak, but average vintage, you will find plenty of producers, also well-known producers, also well-known top growers who will release a Champagne with a single vintage Champagne. And the reason is very simple. It's all about money. It's all about money. And money is a huge addiction for every person, but also for every wine producer. Once you are used to receiving a certain amount of money every year, you want to have that money. So you'll do your best to produce the wine that will bring the money. And that's a pity. And that's where it went wrong.
Yeah. Actually, there was a comment and question about the financial part of it from Wine Alphabet. She was asking the economic aspect of the vintage variation. And it's one of the other things, right? You said, because vintage variation, I think good years can increase the price, but also bad years, if you do a vintage champagne, you can also increase the price, because you say, in the other end, you say as a counter argument, it was a bad year, but I did a great wine. Or like, despite all the conditions, or I had limited production, or you can find ways to increase your price maybe.
It depends on how you look at it. But another example, Barolo. Barolo 2014 was not particularly good. No, it was actually a bad vintage. Let's say it as it is. It was a bad vintage. Tannins weren't right. Acidity was too high. They were rather thin, skeleton-like wines. And then what happens is that I remember it particularly well because we made a tour through Barolo. When was that? 2 years ago. Yes, 2 years ago. And we got a lot of 14s to taste. And Marco Paruso, a highly esteemed producer, decided not to produce any single vineyard 2014 wines. Instead of that, he blended everything together and he made a bigger volume of his standard blend. By doing that, he was losing a lot of money.
Okay.
This costs him whatever, I don't know, 100,000 euros, 200,000 euros, whatever, a lot of money, because you're losing a lot of money. But other producers, I'm thinking, for example, of Vietti, did release all their single vineyard wines, and they were not particularly good. They were better, of course, than the standard blend. Yes, sure, they were better. But they were not what I would expect from an expensive single vineyard Barolo. So I highly respected what Paruso did, but it cost him a lot of money. Nice. And most producers are not capable or not prepared to do that.
Or
money
simply,
is an
yeah,
addiction. Yeah.
addiction. Yeah,
Yeah.
simply they don't, maybe they care, they only care for the finances, so they don't do that.
Yeah, they make the budget, they want to reach the budget, whatever, they're
Yeah.
companies. In a way, I understand, but on the other hand, we are the clients, we are the people buying those wines, and we can decide not to buy wines from a certain vintage if it's too expensive. And what I don't understand is why journalists, we can also do a session on wine journalism in general, but that's
Yes.
where journalists are not doing their jobs properly.
Uh-huh.
Where's the journalist who says, people, I'm sorry, but don't buy this
Okay.
from the famous grower?
So here, two things. First of all, maybe the journals are not independent enough. Maybe they are dependent. And the second part of it, how do we know, like consumers, wine lovers, not necessarily wine professionals, how do they know the vintages, good vintages, bad vintages? Yes, there are vintage charts, vintage reports.
Vintage charts, yes.
Yeah, but a consumer, a wine lover, a regular consumer doesn't necessarily have access to vintage charts.
No, but that's actually an interesting remark you make, because that's true actually. Although if you look them up on internet, you easily find them, because everybody on jensensrobinson.com, on winespectator.com, whatever, you will find vintage charts, and quite often they're actually accessible for free, the information. But actually it's interesting, because 30 years ago, when I started in the business, one of the items you always received from wine merchants, from whatever, were small printed vintage charts. It was like something every wine lover would have his favorite vintage chart that he would carry with him, so that he could easily have a look at the vintages of Burgundy, Bourgogne, Bordeaux, etc. And this has also completely disappeared. People pay, and it's for me another proof that people pay much less attention to it than they did before. And I repeat, there are not that many poor vintages anymore, but they do still exist, and they're completely overlooked.
Yeah, so maybe it's something to think about it, or maybe some producers or distributors, maybe they can come back with this vintage charts. I saw it, a few producers, I don't know, I don't remember where I saw it, but they have in the business cards, for example, a few wine producers, at the front is the business card, and the back is the vintage chart of the region.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think
that's a good idea, and it makes sense. I just saw that somebody made a remark: is vintage variation only important when talking about premium and ultra premium wines? Well, yes and no, but there's some truth in it, of course, because I mean, if you're buying, let's say, €5-6 wine in supermarkets, there still is vintage variation, of course, not so much with Australia or Chile. But let's say with Rioja Crianza, which is a big category, there is certainly vintage variation, but it's true, it's less important, and you're paying less money anyway. So it's true that it's, from my point of view, it should play a much more important role in our judgment of high quality wines, expensive wines. That's true. The focus is more there. Yeah.
And also there is another question here. In your opinion, does vintage variation matter more in wine regions or specific labels that demand cellaring?
No. Cellaring, of course, cellaring is an issue, because not so good vintages are quite often the vintages that you will drink earlier, and that is true. But generally speaking, I mean, there are expensive wines. There are rather expensive wines that are not necessarily meant for cellaring. Let's take Condrieu as an example. But if I buy Condrieu, I will look at the quality of the vintage, definitely, knowing that I will drink it just in a few years. But nevertheless, I will watch the vintage.
Yeah. Okay. Another question here from Gonja asking if if the vintage is not really specifically good enough, can a winemaker make something special out of it?
Not easy, yeah. Not easy. No, no. Well, you know, as I said, you know, when I gave the example of Yeti, but you can use the same example for, let's say, a German VDP producer. Of course, his Grosses Gewächswein will be better than his Gutswein, also in a poor vintage. But that's not my point. My point is he should maybe not produce Grosses Gewächs at all in 2004 in a bad vintage, or at least make it a lot cheaper. That's my point.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, as you said, I mean, if we always go back to the same thing, because it is also, in the end of it, it is financials, economics, and it is much of it is controlled by those decisions. I think, there is not kind of every producer does whatever they want, no, or whatever they need to do.
Yeah. No, but that's true. That's true. That's true. I'm not particularly blaming. I'm not even blaming so much producers, because producers do what they have to do, and everybody wants to make a good living, and they have a company to run, and they have staff to pay, and so it's a free world, and they are free to ask the price that they want. But it's up to us to decide whether we buy or not, to have a critical look or not. And again, I'm most of all blaming journalists. You know, where are the journalists who will take a firm point of view, and especially with the famous and more expensive producers, the journalists are always, you know, buttering up with them and flattering them and saying, well, it was a poor vintage, but he did so much.
But elegant.
And yes, and he made a beautifully elegant wine and all that. It's all rubbish, you know. In the end, it's all rubbish. Yeah.
Because like if we talk about just a quick reminder, when we talk about the bad vintage, we talk about maybe it can be a spring frost and right, or it can be a lot of rain and then in the growing season and or during the harvest, so that the grapes get diluted and they lose the concentration, and which is something really important.
It is, of course, quite often it has to do with problems of not getting fully ripe grapes and getting dilution. That is usually, these are usually the big problems. Then there are secondary problems, which are big problems, but they're maybe a bit easier to control. But you know, problems with mildew or false mildew, whatever, hail, spring frosts, you know, they can also play a role. But I think it's usually about lack of ripeness and concentration.
And so if you have lack of ripeness and less concentration, then already you're starting minus one. You're not starting with really good quality, so it is very difficult, right, to do something really excellent out of it.
Exactly. You know, and you, it's. I've had long discussions about white Burgundy 2014, because Bourgogne lovers tend to claim that that 2014 in Bourgogne was a very good vintage. The funny thing is, I'm not a Bourgogne expert, so I wasn't sure about it. So since then, I've taken every opportunity I got to taste white Bourgogne 2014, and I'm not convinced. And then if you read the description of the year, it says spring was cold, summer was rainy and cold, and then 3 good weeks in September saved the harvest. I'm sorry, but that is nonsense. You cannot produce an outstanding vintage with 3 weeks of sunshine. That's really rubbish. It saved the vintage from the worst. I'm sure that is true, but that's not the way how you get a great vintage, by just 3 good weeks in September. If I'm reading that, I'm thinking, but who's believing this information? Who believes that? You know?
I think in the end, people, they believe, many people, they think that 2014 is a good vintage. If they hear it from some writers or some critics, they don't really read the details of the year. They see, 2014 is a good vintage.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
let's buy.
Exactly. And of course, what you usually get in a vintage like that is that the journalists will visit the top growers. The top growers will have done extra efforts to produce something decent. the top growers are usually happy about the result because they know how difficult it was, and then they end up with something rather decent. They say, well, I'm actually quite happy. And the journalist just sees the happiness and says, oh, well, actually, and then you come with elegance and beautiful acidity, as if acidity is a quality. Acidity is not a quality. Acidity is a quality in combination with, or in the balance with fruit, etc. But acidity alone doesn't mean quality. That's not how it works for me.
Yeah. I think in the meantime, I think I missed a few questions because there are questions and then they're going up. And I don't really want to touch the screen because I'm scared to show my kitchen and everything to everyone. I think I missed a few questions. Sorry, guys. But I saw one interesting question about natural wines. How does vintage variation affect natural wines?
Worse. No. The same. I don't see a difference. I don't see any difference. Yeah. The same.
Same.
Yeah.
Is it not more fragile, or aren't they more affected by vintage variation or bad years because they're natural?
But the question
natural wines there.
Natural wine, or do we actually mean biological or biodynamic wines? But because if we talk about biological wine, then bad vintages can sometimes mean really disastrous vintages. Because it is true, if you've got huge problems with rain and moisture and oidium and whatever, and the only way to handle it is biodynamic approach, then it can get very, very difficult. Look at what happened at Chateau Palmer, who lost almost 2 complete vintages since they changed to biodynamics. Because they weren't able to control outbreaks of oidium.
But also they need some time to adapt to the fully process of biodynamics.
True. No, of course. And there are plenty of examples where biodynamic, let's take Olivier Humbrecht or Domaine Weinbach, they always make good wines also in a poor vintage. They always make good wines. Maybe not great wine in a poor vintage, but good wine in a poor vintage. So I'm not saying that biodynamic won't work in a poor vintage, but the risks can be a little bit bigger, especially in the start.
Okay. So can you tell us your favorite vintages in a few regions, maybe classic regions?
Well, I don't know. I mean, in Bordeaux, obviously 9 and 10 were very, very good. But I always believed that 10 was better than 9, because in the beginning was a bit of discussion. But I think now, looking back after 10 years, I think I was right about it. I think 10 at the end is a bit more balanced, and 9 was it was great, but maybe sometimes a bit too ripe and too heavy wines. Bordeaux 2015, 2016, 2 beautiful vintages for red wines. And actually 16 developed much better than we all thought in the start. It's really, really also a wonderful vintage. Nevertheless, maybe at this point 16 is a bit more elegant, if you want. But probably still 15 is a slightly better vintage. Okay. Champagne, of course, 2002, 2004, 2008, 2012. And I've always particularly liked 2004, although in a way it's maybe the least famous of the 4 I just mentioned. But 2004 was a lovely vintage, beautiful wines in Champagne, and maybe a bit in the shadow of 2002 from the start. And maybe, yes, at the end 2002 is still slightly better, but 4 was also beautiful. I think in many regions in Europe, actually 2015 was a very, very good vintage. It was warm and it was dry, and that's what you need. And of course, there's always the risk that it gets a bit too warm and a bit too dry. And but I always have the impression that people are a bit too worried about that. That if it's getting very warm, they think, oh my God, the acidity is gone, the elegance is gone. Maybe it's not such a great vintage, but at the end of the day, these wines do come around. And 15, I think, I'm quickly thinking Champagne 15 maybe was not that great, but but otherwise, in most regions in Europe and in
Mm-hmm.
Germany and in Austria and whatever, 15 was really a beautiful vintage. Yeah.
Italy also, Tuscany.
Yeah. Oh,
Right?
definitely. Tuscany, Piemonte, yes, definitely. Yeah.
Great. I'm gonna, after the session, I'm gonna post this, your favorite vintages. I mean, the tips, so that if people can buy some wine from those vintages. But obviously, not only the vintage, right? They need to know the producers and so on.
Yeah. No, it's always a combination of things, of course. But yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
No. Yeah.
Well, Times and Wines is asking for Rhone. Rhone.
Also 15.
This 15,
also
good.
15. Yeah, definitely. Both in the south and in the north. Yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
14 very poor in the north and in the south. Yeah. I'm not joking. Really. Yeah.
Okay.
Germany had a string of rather difficult vintages with 17 and 18. Not easy in Germany. Producers were very happy in Germany with I'm talking about Riesling especially. They were very happy with 18 because it was a healthy and very big crop. After 17, which was not really that good, and a small crop, and I think 17 and I think 16 was also rather small, if I remember well. And so the growers were terribly happy with 18, and it was absolutely a decent vintage. And I was happy for the growers that they had volume as well, but it was not a great vintage. The wines do lack concentration, and they're very irregular, also in the große Gewächse. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. We had so much information of the vintages. Great. I made notes.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Frank.
Pleasure.
So we'll see you next week.
Yes.
Sorry. One last comment here. 2011 in Douro Port was one of the greatest vintage as well. 2011 in Port, especially, I mean, that I know, it was a really good vintage.
Yeah, it was absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great.
So
I will see you next week.
No talk Friday evening, coming Friday.
Yes, because Friday is Labor's Day.
And that means you should work.
That means, yes, that means I'm on strike. It's Labor's Day. And I'm fighting for labor's rights.
No, you're going to the beach probably. You're already going to phase 4 in the Spanish.
In my dreams.
No, okay. So next week, Monday again, and subjects will be published this week.
Yes, right? Yes, and it's going to be nice topics on next week. Interesting subject as usual.
I'm sure.
Okay,
great.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Frank. Thanks, everyone. See you on Monday. Bye.